My name is Elizabeth. I'm 34 years old. Last November, I finally told my family I was going no contact. My mother looked me dead in the eyes, laughed, and said, "Good luck. You'll be crawling back, begging by Christmas, just like the ungrateful, useless daughter you've always been." My father sneered. "We've put up with your arrogance for 15 years. Don't expect a single call from us." He changed his number the next morning and told the entire university faculty I was dead to them. 6 months later, a certified letter arrived at my door demanding I return every single rare manuscript I stole from my late mentor within 21 days, or they would sue me. They thought they had buried the truth along with him. What they didn't know was that Maddox had left something far more dangerous than antique books, and by the time their lawyer read it out loud in that conference room, my mother's perfect intellectual smile completely shattered. If you've ever been called the useless one by your own family, hit like and subscribe. Drop "I see you" in the comments if you know exactly how this feels. I promise, the truth they tried to bury is about to bury them instead. The breaking point did not happen with shouting. It happened 6 months ago in November, under the warm, flattering lights of a prestigious literary exhibition in downtown Boston. The gallery was filled with the soft clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the murmurs of academics pretending to admire the displayed folios. I was only there because an independent client had requested my archival assessment on a specific 18th century text. I had brought my 7-year-old daughter Lena because my sitter had canceled at the last minute. Lena stood quietly by my side, clutching a small notebook, trying her best to remain invisible in a room full of giants. Then the familiar scent of expensive gardenia perfume cut through the air. Camila, my mother, materialized from the crowd. She was wearing her signature silk scarf, the one she wore to every book signing, projecting the image of the profound, nurturing author. Vanessa, my older sister, trailed half a step behind her, holding a sleek leather portfolio, playing the role of the devoted editor perfectly. Camila did not greet me. She did not offer a hug. Her eyes immediately darted to Lena, who was struggling to read the large, ornate font on a display placard. Camila's voice was smooth, carrying just enough volume for the two nearest critics to hear. She tilted her head, offering a smile that did not reach her eyes. She said it was such a tragedy that a child from such a brilliant lineage was falling so far behind. She wondered aloud, wrapping her cruelty in fake concern, if my obsession with dusting off dead people's books was the reason my own daughter could not even spell her own name at an acceptable grade level. Vanessa offered a synchronized pitying sigh. A younger version of me would have flinched. A younger version of me would have tried to explain dyslexia, defending my child and my parenting to women who only wanted an audience for my humiliation. But standing there, feeling Lena's small hand tighten around my fingers, a profound stillness washed over me. I looked at Camila. I studied the perfectly calculated angle of her chin, the expectant gleam in her eyes waiting for my emotional collapse. I did not give her the satisfaction. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing but cold clarity. I squeezed Lena's hand gently to reassure her. I told Camila, in a tone as flat as slate, that she would never speak to my daughter again. Then I turned my back on the most celebrated author in Boston. I walked away from the champagne, the murmurs, and the toxic shadow I had lived under for 34 years. I walked out into the crisp November air, feeling lighter than I had in decades. We never looked back. The life I built after that night was deliberately quiet. I am an independent archivist, a restorer of rare books and delicate manuscripts. My apartment in the suburbs of Boston smells faintly of wheat starch, paste Japanese tissue paper, and aged leather. It is a very specific scent, one that Camila had always wrinkled her nose at, calling it the smell of stagnation. To me, it is the smell of truth preserved. I left their sprawling museum-like home when I was 18. I paid for my own degrees. I built my own client list. I refused to be a prop in the background of Camila's author photos, a silent extra in the grand play she directed about her flawless family. My days are measured in careful brushstrokes and the gentle flattening of vellum pages. It is a methodical existence. There are no sudden crises, no manufactured dramas designed to test my loyalty. Lena thrives in this environment. Without the constant looming pressure of her grandmother's impossible expectations, her reading has steadily improved. We sit by the large bay window in the evenings, sounding out words together free from judgment. She feels safe here. I feel safe here. I had spent 15 years quietly stitching my life together, ensuring there were no loose threads for Camila or Gregory to pull. They hated my independence. They viewed my refusal to join Vanessa at the family publishing house as a personal insult, a rejection of the intellectual empire they had built. In their world, you either served the family legacy or you were an ungrateful traitor. My career was steady, respected by a tight-knit circle of historians and private collectors, but it was invisible to the flashing cameras of their literary circles. That was exactly how I wanted it. I preferred the company of honest, crumbling paper over the company of people whose entire identities were fabricated. When the certified letter arrived that Tuesday morning, the sharp knock on the door felt like a physical violation of my sanctuary. The envelope was thick, the return address embossed with the logo of a ruthless Back Bay law firm. The silence in my apartment suddenly felt heavy. I set the envelope on my drafting table next to a bone folder and a small jar of archival glue. I did not open it immediately. I knew exactly who it was from, and I knew exactly why they had sent it now. 6 months of silence was all Camila could endure before she needed to feel powerful again. It was my sanctuary. I finally broke the seal on the envelope. The legal jargon was dense, aggressive, and entirely built on lies. They accused me of financial elder abuse. They demanded the return of $150,000 and a highly coveted collection of original manuscripts. They claimed I had manipulated a vulnerable old man in his final days. I read the words, and instead of fear, I felt a strange, cold calm. I set the letter down and looked across the room at a framed photograph sitting on my bookshelf. It was a picture of Maddox, taken just a year before his heart failed. Maddox had been a legend in the rare book trade, a former editor-in-chief, and my most devoted mentor. He was not blood, but he was the only true father figure I had ever known. Looking at his face, my mind drifted back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon, just days before he passed away. His study had been warm, smelling of cedar and strong black tea. He was weak, confined to his armchair, his breathing shallow, but his mind as razor-sharp as ever. He had asked me to come close. His hands, usually so steady when handling centuries-old parchment, were trembling slightly. He reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. The metal felt cold when he pressed it firmly into my palm. He closed my fingers over it, holding my hand tightly. His eyes, pale but intense, locked onto mine. He told me that Camila would not let his passing go unexploited. He knew my mother better than anyone in the industry did. He knew her insatiable hunger for prestige and her absolute lack of boundaries. He told me the key belonged to a safe deposit box at a private bank downtown. His instructions were explicit. I was not to open the box immediately. I was to wait. He promised me that eventually Camila's greed would outpace her caution. He said she will try to crush you to take what she believes she is owed. When she sends the lawyers, you take this key. He told me that what was inside the box would protect me from those who claimed my blood. He made me promise to stay silent until the exact right moment. Sitting in my apartment, staring at the demand letter, the weight of that brass key in my pocket felt like an anchor, holding me steady in a hurricane. The lock was waiting. To understand the sheer audacity of Camila's lawsuit, you have to understand the narrative she had spun around me for 2 decades. Growing up, the mahogany dining table was a battlefield where worth was measured in public accolades. Gregory would sit at the head of the table, silently slicing his steak, validating his wife's cruelty through his cowardly silence. Vanessa would casually drop mentions of her latest editorial promotions, basking in the glow of Camila's approval. And then there was me. If I spoke about my archival studies or the delicate process of restoring a damaged binding, Camila would sigh. She would call it quaint manual labor. Whenever I traveled across the state to catalog private collections for elderly scholars, people like Maddox, who genuinely valued my expertise, the family narrative grew darker. Camila began telling anyone who would listen that I was the foolish daughter. She claimed I was street smart but family stupid, wasting my talents cleaning up after strangers while ignoring my duty to the family's publishing empire. In her eyes, my dedication to my clients was not a career. It was an act of rebellion. I was branded as the ungrateful outsider who preferred the company of dying academics over her own flesh and blood. The label stuck. It was whispered at faculty parties and literary galas. Elizabeth is so difficult, they would say. She completely abandons her parents to cater to outside. They twisted my compassion into something mercenary. When I spent weeks helping Maddox organize his massive estate, something he trusted no one else to do, Vanessa accused me of playing the martyr. They could not fathom that I did it out of genuine respect and love. In their world, every action was transactional. If I was helping a wealthy old man, they assumed I was scheming, because that is exactly what they would have done. They isolated me socially, ensuring that my professional triumphs were framed as personal betrayals against the family. The emotional toll of constantly defending my own reality was exhausting. It felt like walking through deep mud every time I interacted with them. Yet, ironically, their relentless campaign to paint me as the villain only pushed me further away, straight into the quiet, honest world of archival work. It pushed me toward people who actually saw me. Camila's need to portray me as a conniving outsider was the very thing that solidified my bond with Maddox. They needed a villain. People often ask how an abusive dynamic can last for decades without the victim simply walking out the front door. The answer is terribly simple. The poison is never served in a vial labeled with a skull and crossbones. It is served in crystal glasses at elegant dinner parties poured by people who claim to love you. In my family, the abuse was completely normalized. It was woven into the fabric of our intellectual, sophisticated lives. Camila never screamed. She never threw plates. Instead, she used her vast vocabulary to surgically dismantle my self-worth piece by piece. To understand the psychology of a woman like Camila, you have to look at what she fears most. She was not disgusted by my independence. She was terrified of it. When I left home at 18 to study archival science, I stopped being a reflection of her. I stopped needing her approval to validate my existence. Because she could not control my actions, she had to completely redefine my motives. She had to create a public narrative where my departure was not a sign of strength, but a symptom of profound selfishness and emotional instability. When I began traveling across the state to restore rare collections for elderly academics, she found her perfect angle of attack. I clearly remember sitting at their massive mahogany dining table during one of my rare obligatory holiday visits. I had just finished a grueling 3-week restoration project on a water-damaged collection for a retired historian. I was physically exhausted but incredibly proud of the work. Camila gently swirled the expensive red wine in her glass, offering a patronizing heavy sigh. She told the entire table that it was such a profound tragedy, I wasted my mind playing nursemaid to lonely strangers. She expertly framed my empathy as a fundamental, embarrassing character flaw. According to her, my dedication to my clients was merely a pathetic, transparent attempt to buy affection, because I lacked the intellectual rigor to succeed in the real world on my own merits. It was a brilliant, devastating psychological trap. If I defended my work, I was being overly defensive, overly sensitive, and proving I was exactly as difficult as she claimed. If I stayed silent, I was essentially agreeing with her assessment. By publicly labeling my genuine care for others as manipulative and mercenary, she managed to strip away the very core of my identity. She desperately needed me to be the defective, useless daughter so that she could seamlessly maintain her position as the long-suffering, magnanimous matriarch. It took me years of specialized therapy to truly understand that I was not the broken one. I was just the designated scapegoat in her carefully curated theater of academic perfection. I finally saw the invisible bars she had meticulously built around my mind. It was a calculated cage. The antidote to that emotional poison came into my life exactly 5 years ago. His name was Maddox. He was a retired editor-in-chief, and undeniably one of the most prolific, respected collectors of rare manuscripts on the entire East Coast. He lived alone in a sprawling, slightly drafty wooden house in Concord, completely surrounded by towering walls of first editions and fragile, leather-bound folios. Camila had spent years actively trying to secure an invitation to his private study, desperately hoping to leverage his massive influence for her own academic prestige. He had politely but firmly declined every single one of her elegant letters. He simply did not care about social climbing or literary galas. He only cared about the quiet preservation of history. He initially hired me to formally assess and catalog a highly fragile, disorganized collection of 19th-century poetry he had recently acquired. I arrived at his secluded home expecting the typical suffocating arrogance I had grown so accustomed to dealing with in Boston's elite literary circles. Instead, I found a quiet, deeply observant man in a worn wool cardigan who immediately offered me a warm cup of Earl Grey tea. He did not ask me a single question about my mother's famous books. He did not care about the circulating society gossip. He silently watched me handle a crumbling, delicate spine with specialized Japanese tissue and bone folders. He instantly recognized the meticulous, quiet respect I had for the preservation work. Over the following months, a profound professional relationship slowly and naturally blossomed into something much deeper. Maddox slowly became the fiercely protective father figure I had always needed, but never actually had. Our entire relationship was built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, shared intellectual passion, and comfortable silence, completely devoid of the toxic transactional nature of my biological family. When Lena was officially diagnosed with severe dyslexia at age 5, Camila had practically rolled her eyes in public, cruel enough to suggest it was a direct result of my lack of proper academic discipline at home. Maddox, on the other hand, quietly ordered a massive library of specialized audiobooks. He even commissioned a local carpenter to build a heavy, slanted wooden reading stand perfectly sized for a small child, making it significantly easier for her to focus on large print texts without physical strain. He always treated Lena with an endless, remarkably gentle patience that brought tears to my eyes. He never once spoke down to her. He would sit peacefully in his oversized armchair for hours, simply listening to her struggle through a very simple sentence, offering a warm, genuine smile of encouragement every single time she successfully sounded out a difficult syllable. For the very first time in my entire adult life, I profoundly felt what it was like to be truly supported without any hidden conditions, emotional debts, or looming expectations. Maddox never once tried to mold me into a specific convenient version of a daughter to suit his own ego. He just gave me a solid, incredibly safe place to stand and figure it out for myself. He gave me the deep, unconditional validation my parents had maliciously withheld. He truly saw me. The decline in his health was brutally fast. It started as a mild cough in early September and quickly escalated into severe, unmanageable heart failure by late October. Maddox adamantly refused to be transferred to a sterile hospital room. He consciously chose to stay in his beloved wooden house in Concord under the supervision of a private hospice care team. I immediately put all my other archival projects on a strict hold and moved into his guest room temporarily. I needed to meticulously manage his remaining archives, coordinate with his nurses, and simply ensure he was completely comfortable. Suddenly, out of absolute nowhere, Camila and Gregory appeared on his front porch. They had not spoken a single word to Maddox in over a decade, having been repeatedly ignored by him. Yet there they stood armed, with a container of expensive organic soup and faces painted with deeply unconvincing theatrical sympathies. I knew exactly why they were there. They did not care about a dying man's comfort. They wanted unrestricted access to the uncatalogued section of his massive library, hoping to secure exclusive publishing rights to rare materials before the estate was officially settled. I stood firmly in the narrow hallway, crossing my arms, physically blocking the heavy oak door that led to his private study. Camila immediately deployed her soft, breathy, deeply concerned voice. She claimed she only wanted to help me carry the heavy burden of his care and perhaps assist in securing his monumental literary legacy for the greater good. I knew it was a thinly veiled attempt to steal his life's work. I looked right past her fake smile and told them in a low, unwavering tone that visiting hours were strictly over and he was not receiving any guests. Gregory puffed out his chest, attempting to use his usual professorial authority. He sharply reprimanded me for my supposed disrespect and my embarrassing lack of basic hospitality. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my position. I simply stood my ground, immovable as a stone wall. Maddox was sleeping peacefully just a few feet away, heavily medicated and fragile. I was absolutely not going to let my parents turn his sacred deathbed into a disgusting networking event for their publishing house. Camila's mask slipped just a fraction of an inch. Her eyes hardened into two cold, dark points of absolute fury. She realized she could not manipulate her way past me. I was no longer the frightened teenager who craved her validation. I was the gatekeeper to the one thing she wanted most, and I was denying her entry. They eventually turned around and marched back to their luxury sedan, deeply angry and profoundly offended by my audacity. I watched their taillights disappear down the long gravel driveway. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I walked back inside, checked Maddox's breathing, and quietly secured the house. I locked the heavy door. You simply cannot say no to a powerful, deeply insecure narcissist without facing severe, immediate consequences. Camila's retaliation for being firmly turned away at Maddox's door was incredibly swift, utterly brutal, and entirely off the official record. The malicious, calculated whispers started almost instantly at exclusive university faculty dinners, high-end gallery openings, and private academic clubs across the city. I was obviously not invited to any of these prestigious events, but the toxic echoes inevitably reached me through the tight-knit, gossip-fueled grapevine of Boston's archival community. Camila painted a beautifully tragic, thoroughly convincing picture of herself as a deeply grieving mother. She expertly played the role of the heartbroken matriarch, claiming to be completely helpless as she watched her mentally unstable, financially desperate daughter take cruel advantage of a brilliant old man with rapidly failing cognitive health. She began casually telling highly influential people that I had intentionally and maliciously isolated Maddox from his true friends and lifelong colleagues. She carefully crafted a completely false narrative that I was a mercenary archivist, specifically preying on his late-stage loneliness to systematically siphon off his incredibly valuable assets. It was a brilliantly constructed, utterly devastating lie. It masterfully weaponized my genuine care and deep empathy against me, turning my greatest strength into my darkest alleged flaw. The resulting professional fallout was a very slow, agonizing bleed. Several high-profile private clients suddenly canceled their lucrative long-term restoration contracts, with me universally citing vague, unconvincing scheduling conflicts. My hard-earned, meticulously built reputation in the broader academic circle took a massive, incredibly heavy hit. Vanessa even eagerly went on a highly popular literary podcast and publicly defended Camila's deep maternal grief regarding my supposedly troubling and erratic life choices. They were meticulously destroying my sole livelihood to brutally punish me for my quiet disobedience. I could have easily fought back. I could have drafted angry emails, released public statements, or actively threatened aggressive defamation suits against them. But I didn't. Maddox was actively dying in the very next room, requiring my constant, undivided, and gentle attention. Lena was simultaneously struggling with an intensive new reading program at school and deeply needed her mother to be entirely emotionally present. I simply did not have the excess energy nor the desire to aggressively fight their carefully fabricated ghosts. I consciously chose to completely ignore the deafening academic noise. I focused entirely on the tangible, genuinely real things in my daily life. I focused heavily on the comforting, familiar smell of the old books. I focused on the steady, rhythmic sound of Maddox breathing. I focused intensely on Lena's small but beautiful victories. I knew deep down that engaging with a narcissist's elaborate smear campaign only provides them with the exact emotional oxygen they so desperately crave. If I fought back loudly, I would just be playing my assigned role as the dramatic, incredibly difficult daughter perfectly. So I tightly wrapped myself in an impenetrable, heavy armor of absolute silence. I let them eagerly spin their elaborate fictional tales of my supposed greed. I let them convince their shallow, sycophantic circle of friends that I was a complete monster. I knew the absolute truth, and far more importantly, Maddox knew the truth before he passed. I let them keep talking. Maddox passed away very quietly on a cold, rainy Tuesday morning in early December. The private funeral service was intentionally kept very small and dignified, attended strictly by his genuinely real friends, loyal former editorial colleagues, and the few specific authors he had truly respected during his long, storied career. Camila and Gregory predictably did not attend the service, likely realizing their highly performative. Superficial grief would find absolutely no receptive audience among people who actually knew the man. A few short weeks later, harboring a very naive, fleeting hope that the harsh, undeniable reality of death might have finally offered them some shred of decent human perspective, I made a very conscious decision. I attended Vanessa's highly publicized glamorous book launch party at a lavish downtown hotel. It was an undeniable foolish mistake, but perhaps a psychologically necessary one to finally clear my own lingering conscience. I simply wanted to tell them clearly, and face-to-face, that Maddox's vast collection was entirely legally secure, and that there was absolutely no logical need for the continued hostility or the exhausting malicious whisper. Campaigns. I found the three of them standing very closely together by the elaborate catering table, holding expensive champagne flutes and laughing loudly at a shared joke. Before I could even manage to finish my polite opening sentence, Camila sharply and dramatically put up a perfectly manicured hand to silence me. She gave me that incredibly familiar, deeply cutting look, the exact look that clearly communicated I was something foul she had unfortunately stepped on. She completely lowered her voice to a vicious, controlled hiss, deliberately ensuring the nearby important guests could not hear the dripping venom. She explicitly and coldly told me I was a walking, breathing embarrassment to the respected family name. Gregory immediately took an aggressive step forward, his face deeply flushed with unearned, pompous indignation, and firmly ordered me to leave the premises immediately before I completely ruined Vanessa's critically important night with my disgustingly toxic presence. Vanessa just nervously looked away, remaining silently and pathetically complicit in their relentless cruelty. They absolutely did not want to hear the truth. They did not want peace, logical closure, or a functional family relationship. They desperately wanted to maintain the twisted, fictional narrative where they were the noble, suffering victims, and I was the irredeemable, greedy thief. I stood there for a very long moment, simply looking at the three of them. They were standing tightly together in their perfect, utterly impenetrable circle of shared delusion and endless self-congratulation. I felt a sudden, profound, and beautifully cold sense of clarity wash over my entire body. I realized with absolute unwavering certainty that I had spent my entire adult life desperately trying to politely pick a complex lock on a massive, reinforced brick wall that simply had no door. There was absolutely nothing left to say. There was nothing left to save, fix, or repair. I nodded exactly once, a completely calm and highly decisive motion. I slowly turned around and walked purposefully out of the crowded, noisy venue, leaving them forever to their cheap champagne and their comfortable lies. The door was permanently closed. The months that immediately followed my permanent, unannounced departure from their toxic lives were not filled with dramatic, tearful confrontations or explosive shouting arguments. They were defined by a profound, methodical, and incredibly healing quiet. I purposefully poured all of my residual emotional energy into the meticulous, highly specialized daily work of archival restoration. My independent career, the very thing Camila had relentlessly and publicly mocked as a quaint, utterly useless hobby for a failed academic, quickly became the rock-solid foundation of my absolute financial and psychological independence. I spent my long, peaceful days inside my sunlit, quiet apartment, entirely surrounded by the comforting, earthy smell of aged vellum, delicate Japanese tissue paper, and freshly mixed wheat starch paste. It was a life built on incredibly precise, careful, and delicate movements. I was officially hired by a very prominent, highly selective historical society to comprehensively restore a severely water-damaged collection of 18th century botanical journals. The intensive work required countless hours of unbroken meditative concentration, using remarkably fine brushes and specialized bone folders to carefully and permanently flatten out centuries-old wrinkles without tearing the incredibly fragile, irreplaceable fibers. It was incredibly tedious, completely unglamorous work that offered absolutely no public applause or immediate gratification. There were no flashing press cameras, no prestigious shiny literary awards, and no fawning desperate crowds of sycophantic academics eagerly waiting to praise my supposed genius. It was the exact, literal opposite of the hollow, deeply performative life my parents desperately lived, and I loved every single solitary second of it. As I gently and painstakingly repaired the badly torn pages, I slowly realized I was simultaneously quietly repairing my own deeply fractured sense of self-worth. For 34 long years, I had been completely systematically conditioned by Camila to genuinely believe that my inherent value was entirely dependent on how useful I was to the family's grand, fabricated narrative. Because I did not write massive best-selling novels or edit prestigious, award-winning anthologies like Vanessa I Was permanently labeled the defective, embarrassing outsider. But in the quiet, absolute solitude of my organized workspace, I finally and truly understood that my deep capacity for careful, patient preservation was a remarkably rare and highly valuable gift. I did not need to desperately manufacture a fake, arrogant intellectual persona to be completely worthy of basic human respect. My loyal clients, mostly quiet, dedicated historians and deeply private collectors who truly valued genuine, proven expertise over cheap social status, consistently treated me with a profound, unspoken professional dignity. They implicitly trusted me with their absolute most prized, irreplaceable historical possessions. They happily paid my premium invoices promptly and enthusiastically recommended my highly specialized services to their tight-knit, exclusive circles. I was quietly and steadily building a highly lucrative, universally respected independent business entirely on my own hard-earned merits. I did not need the heavy, suffocating family name to magically open heavy doors for me, and I certainly did not need Camilla's highly conditional, deeply manipulative approval to finally feel successful. I was undeniably thriving in the exact quiet space she had desperately tried to convince me was a humiliating, useless dead end. The silence was beautiful. The absolute most profound, beautiful transformation during those 6 long months of absolute unbroken silence did not actually happen to me. It happened entirely to my 7-year-old daughter, when we were still deeply, miserably entangled in the suffocating, inescapable web of elite family obligations. Lena was a deeply anxious, incredibly withdrawn, and highly nervous child. The mandatory formal Sunday dinners had essentially been a terrifying, weekly psychological minefield for her. She instinctively and painfully knew that Camilla's piercing, highly critical eyes were constantly assessing her every move, actively looking for any minor, childish flaw or slight academic delay to ruthlessly and publicly dissect. Because Lena struggled significantly with severe diagnosed dyslexia, she had quickly and tragically learned to carefully make herself as incredibly small and completely invisible as physically possible whenever her intimidating grandmother was anywhere in the room. Once the heavy, imposing door to that highly toxic, completely dysfunctional family dynamic was permanently and decisively closed, the heavy, invisible, crushing weight completely lifted from Lena's small, tense shoulders. Our quiet, modest suburban apartment instantly became a genuine, impregnable fortress of absolute emotional safety and endless, gentle patience. Without the constant, looming, terrifying threat of Camilla's sharp, cruel, intellectual mockery hanging over her head, Lena slowly and beautifully began to genuinely relax into her own personality. We carefully established a deeply comforting, highly predictable, and soothing evening routine. After a quiet dinner, we would sit very closely together by the large, slightly drafty bay window overlooking the street. I would carefully bring out the heavy, perfectly slanted wooden reading stand that Maddox had thoughtfully and lovingly commissioned specifically for her just a year before he tragically passed away. The incredibly smooth, highly polished cherry wood of the custom reading stand was a constant, warm, and highly tangible daily reminder of the absolutely one single person in our orbit who had truly, genuinely loved us without any cruel, hidden condescension. I would carefully place a colorful, large-print, highly engaging storybook securely on the sturdy wooden ledge. Lena would trace the dark, heavy letters very slowly and deliberately with her small index finger. In the dark past, if she ever slightly stumbled over a difficult, multisyllabic word, she would immediately freeze in pure, unadulterated panic, fully anticipating a harsh, deeply disappointed sigh from across the elegant room. But now, in the profound, beautiful safety of our quiet home, there were absolutely no heavy sighs. There was absolutely no crushing intellectual judgment. There was only my quiet, incredibly steady, and endlessly encouraging voice gently and patiently guiding her through the complicated phonetics. It took many long weeks of incredible, unwavering patience, but the beautiful, undeniable breakthrough finally happened on a quiet, snowy evening in late January. Lena sat up incredibly straight, took a very deep, highly courageous breath, and perfectly read an entire fairly complex paragraph entirely out loud, without pausing, hesitating, or stumbling even once. When she confidently finished the very last sentence, she looked straight up at me, her bright eyes incredibly wide and completely filled with an overwhelming, pure, and totally unadulterated joy. She was absolutely not a broken, defective, or embarrassing child. She was a brilliant, highly capable girl who simply needed a genuinely safe, deeply supportive environment to finally and beautifully bloom. Watching her confidently and happily sound out the words, completely free from any lingering fear, I knew with absolute, unwavering certainty that cutting contact had undeniably been the greatest, most vital decision of my entire life. She was finally safe. Establishing a strict, non-negotiable boundary with a highly narcissistic elite family is never a completely clean, peaceful break. They absolutely do not respectfully accept your absence. They universally view it as a deeply insulting, entirely unacceptable challenge to their ultimate, unquestioned authority. During those first few quiet, healing months, the relentless attempts to aggressively breach my carefully constructed emotional fortress were incredibly subtle, deeply manipulative, and highly calculated. They predictably did not come from Camila or Gregory directly, as their immense, incredibly fragile egos absolutely forbade them from ever making the very first, potentially humiliating, conciliatory move. Instead, the persistent, highly annoying probes came almost entirely from Vanessa, happily and dutifully playing her eternally assigned transparent role as the deeply concerned, morally superior family peacekeeper. In late February, an incredibly lengthy, heavily emotionally loaded email suddenly and disruptively arrived in my private work inbox. The simple, incredibly loaded subject line was just the word family. I sat quietly at my professional drafting table, the soft, warm glow of my specialized desk lamp clearly illuminating the bright screen, and calmly read the manipulative message. Vanessa wrote with an incredibly practiced, highly artificial, and deeply theatrical sorrow. She explicitly and dramatically detailed exactly how deeply distressed, shattered, and broken our aging mother supposedly was over my supposedly highly irrational, incredibly cruel, and purely impulsive decision to selfishly tear the prestigious family completely apart. She even heavily and maliciously implied that Gregory's recently elevated blood pressure issues were a direct, undeniable, and entirely preventable result of the immense, crushing stress I was selfishly causing all of them. The long email was a completely perfect, absolute textbook example of elite, highly sophisticated emotional manipulation. It contained absolutely no genuine, heartfelt apology, absolutely no acknowledgement of the horrific, unforgivable incident at the crowded literary exhibition, and certainly no basic fundamental respect for my explicitly stated personal boundaries. It was merely a heavily guilt-laden, demanding ultimatum for my immediate, unconditional surrender and my swift, obedient return to the very bottom of the established family hierarchy. Just a few short years ago, an aggressive email exactly like this would have instantly sent my heart racing into a full panic. I would have spent agonizing, completely sleepless hours frantically drafting and nervously deleting dozens of highly defensive, overly emotional, and ultimately useless replies. Desperately trying to logically justify my own lived reality to people who were fundamentally consciously committed to intentionally misunderstanding me. But as I sat there in the deep, comforting, absolute quiet of my secure apartment, simply listening to the soft, rhythmic, and incredibly peaceful sound of Lena breathing easily in the very next room, I carefully checked my own internal physical reaction. My heart rate was completely remarkably and beautifully steady. My hands resting on the desk were absolutely still. I felt absolutely no overwhelming, suffocating surge of that familiar, toxic family guilt. And I certainly felt no desperate, pathetic, lingering need to explain or defend myself. I calmly looked at the long, highly manipulative paragraphs of angry text on the bright screen, finally recognizing them for exactly what they truly were: completely powerless, empty words, sent by fundamentally powerless, miserable people. I did not type a single solitary letter in response. I did not angrily forward the long message to a sympathetic friend to bitterly complain. I simply moved my cursor, confidently clicked the delete icon, and permanently emptied the digital trash folder. The entire highly calculated emotional attack was completely neutralized and permanently erased in exactly less than 3 short seconds. I calmly and quietly closed my laptop, gently picked up my specialized bone folder, and peacefully returned to flattening the damp, fragile edges of an 18th century botanical print. They had absolutely no power over my life unless I voluntarily handed it to them. and I was officially permanently done handing it over. The silence remained unbroken. The catalyst for their ultimate destruction arrived precisely 6 months after I had walked away. It began not with a direct confrontation, but with a highly publicized, incredibly arrogant article in the Sunday Arts section of the Boston Globe. A trusted colleague from a university archive had silently forwarded me the digital link early on a Monday morning. The lengthy feature was an incredibly flattering, sycophantic interview with Camilla, discussing her supposedly brilliant, enduring legacy in the modern literary world. Her last 2 highly anticipated books had quietly but undeniably underperformed, and it was a widely known secret in academic circles that she desperately needed a massive, prestigious victory to solidly cement her fading relevance. Halfway through the glowing, entirely rehearsed interview, Camilla casually but deliberately dropped a massive, highly calculated bombshell. She elegantly informed the eager journalist that her prestigious publishing house was in the incredibly final, delicate stages of formally acquiring and exclusively curating the legendary lost private archives of the late, great Maddox. She spoke about him with an incredibly sickening, fabricated reverence, completely omitting the undisputed fact that she had viciously despised him while he was actually alive. She confidently claimed that her family was deeply personally honored to be officially trusted as the sole rightful stewards of his monumental historical legacy. Reading her arrogant, completely fabricated words on the glowing screen, I felt a deep, profound wave of absolute disgust, immediately followed by an incredibly sharp, highly analytical clarity. Maddox's incredibly valuable, highly coveted collection was absolutely not lost, and it was certainly not actively waiting to be eagerly acquired by her fading publishing house. It was legally, completely, and securely resting under my sole, undisputed control. Camilla's massive, unchecked narcissistic ego had finally pushed her to make a completely fatal, incredibly public miscalculation. She had arrogantly claimed ownership of something incredibly valuable that she absolutely did not legally possess deeply, assuming she could simply bully, threaten, or completely crush me into silently handing it over to save her precious public fate. She had essentially painted herself into a massive, highly public corner. Her insatiable, blinding greed for intellectual prestige had completely overridden whatever tiny shred of strategic caution she might have possessed. She desperately needed Maddox's incredibly rare manuscripts to successfully validate her own crumbling professional superiority, and she absolutely knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was the one single quiet obstacle standing directly in her way. The highly publicized newspaper article was not just a pathetic, arrogant boast. It was a very clear, undeniable declaration of impending ruthless war. Sure enough, exactly 24 hours after the incredibly arrogant article was published, the heavy, intimidating certified letter from the aggressive Back Bay law firm aggressively arrived at my quiet front door. They were officially accusing me of horrific financial elder abuse and legally demanding the immediate, unconditional surrender of $150,000, along with the entirety of Maddox's priceless collection. They actually thought they could terrify me into total submission with dense legal threats and the looming, terrifying specter of public ruin. They deeply believed I would immediately fold exactly as I had always done when I was younger. But they had absolutely no idea what they were actually dealing with now. The trap was set. I sat quietly at my drafting table, the heavy, intimidating certified letter resting completely flat beside my cold cup of morning coffee. The dense, aggressive legal threats essentially demanding the immediate, unconditional surrender of Maddox's entire collection were meticulously designed to induce absolute, paralyzing panic. They explicitly threatened massive civil action, total financial ruin, and the complete, highly public destruction of my carefully rebuilt professional reputation. I read the viciously worded, demanding paragraphs twice. I did not cry. My hands did not shake. I did not feel a single fleeting urge to immediately call Gregory and desperately beg for unwarranted mercy. Instead, I calmly reached for my cell phone and dialed a specific number I had kept securely saved for exactly this inevitable scenario. I called Grace. She was an incredibly sharp, deeply experienced, and highly ruthless attorney who specialized exclusively in complex estates and impenetrable trusts. Maddox had personally introduced us 3 years ago, explicitly instructing me to keep her contact information closely guarded. she answered on the second ring, her voice crisp, highly professional and completely devoid of unnecessary emotion. I calmly read her the exact threatening demands outlined by Camila's highly aggressive legal representation. Grace let out a short, completely humorless, and highly clinical laugh. She explicitly told me that the opposing counsel was fundamentally relying entirely on completely fabricated intimidation tactics and absolutely lacked any tangible legal foundation. "They are absolutely fishing, Elizabeth," she stated firmly, her tone incredibly steady. "They deeply assume you are completely terrified and entirely legally unprotected. I need you to go to the private bank downtown immediately. Use the key he gave you. We need to officially review the exact contents of the box before we schedule the meeting." I agreed immediately. I did not ask any panicked questions. I firmly told Grace that I had absolutely no intention of simply defending myself against their vicious, fabricated lies. I told my lawyer, my voice completely cold and unwaveringly resolute, "We are absolutely not going to play defense, Grace. We are going to completely end their careers." She simply replied that she would eagerly see me in her office at 2 o'clock. I ended the short call, stood up smoothly, and carefully placed the incredibly arrogant demand letter directly into the recycling bin. I did not need to keep their ridiculous fabricated threats. I was no longer the incredibly terrified, easily manipulated little girl desperately seeking their highly conditional approval. I was an independent, fiercely protective mother and the legally appointed guardian of a massive, incredibly valuable legacy. If you have ever finally found the exact, undeniable proof you desperately needed to permanently clear your name and silence your abusers, hit the like button right now. Let's finish this together. I grabbed my heavy winter coat, firmly checked my pockets to ensure the cold, heavy brass key was secure, and confidently locked the sturdy front door of my apartment. I walked down the quiet suburban street toward the train station, my mind completely clear and intensely focused on the exact, incredibly methodical steps ahead. I was not walking into a terrifying, unpredictable battle. I was simply executing a perfect, legally binding procedure that had been meticulously planned for years. The endgame had begun. The heavy, ornate door to Grace's corner office in downtown Boston closed with a satisfying, solid click. The sounds of the busy city traffic were immediately muffled, replaced by the quiet, reassuring hum of a high-end air conditioning system. Grace sat behind her expansive glass desk wearing a tailored navy suit, her sharp eyes scanning the thick stack of aged, yellowing documents I had carefully brought straight from the bank's secure vault. She did not rush. She meticulously read every single line of the heavy, notarized parchment, her silver pen occasionally tapping against the smooth glass surface. I sat in the leather chair opposite her, drinking a glass of sparkling water, feeling the residual adrenaline slowly bleed out of my system. When she finally finished, she neatly stacked the papers, folded her hands together, and looked up at me with a rare, genuine smile. She told me that Maddox had executed a flawless, legally impenetrable maneuver. He had not simply left me a traditional last will and testament, which Camila could easily drag into probate court and heavily contest for years, draining my financial resources. Instead, Maddox had quietly established a fully funded cumulative probate, legally binding, irrevocable trust. He had officially transferred the absolute legal ownership of his entire estate, the financial assets, and every single rare manuscript directly into the trust years before his failing health became a public issue. Grace leaned forward, explaining the precise, beautiful mechanics of the law. To fully understand the profound power of this document, you have to understand exactly how a narcissist's mind operates. People like Camila fundamentally believe that rules, boundaries, and even basic reality are completely negotiable if they simply apply enough emotional pressure or public intimidation. But an irrevocable trust is not an emotional boundary. It is a mathematical, legally absolute fortress. Once the designated assets are officially transferred into it, they no longer belong to the grantor's personal estate. They belong exclusively to the trust. The original grantor cannot casually alter it, and a greedy, ambitious family certainly cannot successfully sue to dissolve it. It completely bypasses the messy public probate process entirely. Grace explicitly clarified that Camila could scream to the local newspapers, she could completely fabricate outrageous stories about my supposed manipulation, and she could aggressively threaten me with a dozen expensive, intimidating lawsuits. None of it mattered. In the cold, unfeeling, perfectly objective eyes of the American legal system, Camila was nothing more than an absolute stranger, angrily knocking her fists against a solid, reinforced brick wall. There were absolutely no legal loopholes for her expensive attorneys to strategically exploit. The profound intellectual satisfaction of that moment was overwhelming. I had spent my entire life frantically trying to logically defend my reality against my mother's endless shifting emotional manipulations. I had constantly tried to prove my basic worth using her rigged impossible rules. But Maddox had given me a weapon that completely ignored her rules. He had given me a flawless, documented legal process. The absolute truth was no longer just a fragile matter of my word against her highly publicized, deeply respected reputation. The undeniable truth was now a heavily notarized, legally binding entity backed by the full authority of the law, complete with verified signatures and professional witnesses. We had completely won. While Grace was quietly organizing the heavy trust documents to prepare formal copies for the upcoming meeting, I carefully opened the second, much smaller manila envelope I had extracted from the bottom of Maddox's safety deposit box. The adhesive seal was old and brittle, flaking away easily under my thumb. Inside, wrapped delicately in a layer of protective archival tissue, was a small, slightly faded blue leather journal. I immediately recognized the specific, high-quality binding from the late 90s. It belonged to Eleanor Maddox's brilliant, quietly observant late wife, who had tragically passed away decades ago. I opened the stiff cover, recognizing her elegant, cursive handwriting filling the lined pages. Maddox had never explicitly mentioned this specific journal to me. I began to carefully read the first few entries, expecting to find mundane daily notes about their garden or their quiet academic life together in Concord. Instead, my blood ran completely cold. As I slowly turned the fragile pages, reading her profound, highly intellectual musings on grief, the heavy burden of female academia, and the isolating nature of historical preservation, a deeply sickening, terrifying sense of recognition washed over me. The unique, striking metaphors, the specific, highly unusual phrasing, the deeply personal philosophical conclusions about human memory. I had read these exact, specific words before. They were not just similar. They were absolutely, undeniably identical to the core celebrated chapters of Camila's massive, breakout best-selling memoir. The very book that had successfully launched her into the prestigious upper echelons of the literary elite, winning her prestigious awards and securing her permanent, unshakable tenure. I sat completely frozen in the leather chair, staring at the faded blue ink. I pulled out my phone, quickly pulled up a digital copy of my mother's famous book, and began desperately cross-referencing the texts. Paragraph after paragraph, page after page, the incredibly damning truth unfolded before my eyes. Camila had not simply borrowed a loose general concept or been mildly inspired by a casual conversation. She had systematically, ruthlessly, and methodically plagiarized a dead woman's private, most vulnerable thoughts. She had brazenly stolen Eleanor's brilliant intellectual soul, repackaged it under her own famous name, and built an entire massive career on the resulting stolen prestige. I felt physically ill, the sheer breathtaking magnitude of the arrogant deception pressing heavily against my chest. Maddox had absolutely known. He had quietly known the dark truth for decades, silently keeping the original journal securely locked away patiently, waiting for the exact perfect moment to expose the monumental fraud. He had not just left me a solid financial inheritance to secure my future. He had intentionally, deliberately handed me the absolute, undeniable power to completely obliterate Camila's meticulously fabricated public legacy. She had spent my entire life publicly humiliating me, calling me the useless, untalented daughter who contributed absolutely nothing to the great family empire. Now I held the physical, undeniable proof that the entire celebrated empire was constructed on a foundation of cruel intellectual theft. I carefully closed the blue leather journal, tracing the smooth cover with my trembling fingers, my mind racing with cold calculations. The mask was slipping. The Monday night, immediately preceding the highly anticipated legal meeting, I sat alone at my sturdy drafting table. The apartment was profoundly quiet, save for the soft, steady ticking of the old wall clock and the gentle sound of the winter wind outside the window. I had successfully put Lena to bed an hour earlier, reading her 3 extra chapters to ensure she slept deeply and peacefully. Now, the real methodical work began. I had driven to an office supply store on Boylston Street that afternoon and specifically purchased a thick, professional black binder. I was not frantically pacing the floor crying or rehearsing angry emotional speeches in the bathroom mirror. I was building a highly organized, completely undeniable legal bomb. I carefully opened the empty black binder and inserted 4 heavy reinforced plastic dividers. Behind tab number 1, I meticulously placed the flawless, highly certified copies of Maddox's Irrevocable Trust, ensuring the notary seals and the bold, undeniable dates were clearly visible on the very first page. This was the impenetrable legal shield that would instantly block their greedy, fabricated financial demands. Behind tab number 2, I carefully placed the crisp, high-resolution color photocopies of Eleanor's blue leather journal, strategically paired with highlighted matching excerpts pulled directly from Camilla's best-selling, critically acclaimed memoir. This was the incredibly sharp, devastating sword. Behind tab number 3, I inserted a sealed white envelope containing a highly specific piece of specialized medical documentation. Grace had specifically advised me to request this crucial file from Maddox's primary physician months ago, fully anticipating the exact, desperate, and entirely predictable counterattack my mother's lawyers would inevitably attempt to deploy when cornered. I did not write a single emotional note. I did not include any angry rambling letters detailing my damaged childhood or demanding a long overdue apology. The cold, hard documents were vastly more articulate and exponentially more damaging than any emotional outburst I could possibly muster. The profound, heavy stillness in the apartment was deeply intoxicating. For over 2 decades, every single interaction with my immediate family had been an exhausting, highly unpredictable performance, where I was constantly forced to play the defensive losing role. Tonight I felt absolutely no fear. I felt the deep, settling calm of a person who has already secured the absolute, unquestionable victory long before the battle has even officially begun. I slowly closed the heavy black binder, the metal rings snapping shut with a sharp, decisive click that echoed loudly in the silent room. If you are finally ready to watch a deeply arrogant narcissist's carefully constructed public mask completely slip and shatter into a million pieces, tell me in the comments below. The highly anticipated meeting is about to start. I carried the heavy black binder into my quiet bedroom, placed it gently on the small nightstand next to my keys, and turned off the warm bedside lamp. For the first time in 34 years, facing the imminent, terrifying prospect of seeing my parents the next morning, my heart rate did not elevate a single beat. I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I was completely ready. The imposing conference room at the Back Bay law firm was aggressively designed to silently communicate immense wealth and absolute undeniable authority. It smelled faintly of expensive floor wax, freshly brewed bitter coffee, and old polished oak. A massive, gleaming wooden table dominated the center of the room, completely surrounded by 12 heavy, ergonomic leather chairs. Grace sat confidently at the head of the table, her posture perfectly straight, radiating a calm, clinical professionalism. I sat directly to her right, wearing a simple, tailored black suit. The heavy black binder rested completely flat on the wooden surface, perfectly aligned in front of me. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy glass door swung open. Reginald, the incredibly expensive, highly aggressive senior partner Camilla had hired, confidently walked in first. He casually tossed a thick leather portfolio onto the table, his posture practically dripping with arrogant certainty. Gregory closely followed, wearing a tweed jacket that looked slightly too large for his shrinking frame. He immediately crossed his arms over his chest, adopting his usual, deeply intimidating professorial glare. Vanessa slipped in quietly, immediately dropping her eyes to her expensive shoes, desperately avoiding any direct eye contact with me. And finally, Camilla made her grand, highly theatrical entrance. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored, cream-colored silk blouse and dark slacks, her hair perfectly styled to project an image of effortless intellectual superiority. She slowly took the seat directly across the wide table from me. She deliberately smoothed her blouse, let out a soft, patronizing sigh, and offered me her signature, deeply condescending smile. It was the exact calculated smile of a highly benevolent, long-suffering matriarch who has reluctantly arrived to grant unearned clemency to a severely troubled, hopelessly misguided child. She did not say hello. She did not ask how her 7-year-old granddaughter was doing. Reginald cleared his throat loudly, successfully drawing the entire room's attention. He leaned forward aggressively, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "We are all incredibly busy professionals here, so I will be brief," he started, his tone clipped and heavily rehearsed. "My esteemed clients are completely prepared to be highly generous today. We are formally offering a simple, painless settlement. You immediately return the stolen manuscripts and the misappropriated funds, and my clients will officially agree to drop all pending civil charges regarding financial elder abuse. We can handle this quietly entirely within the family." He aggressively tapped his gold pen against his notepad, letting the heavy, threatening silence hang in the air, deeply expecting me to visibly crumble under the immense pressure. He expected tears, desperate explanations, or frantic apologies. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight in the heavy leather chair. I simply looked directly at Camila, my face completely blank, entirely devoid of any readable emotion. I let the oppressive, heavy silence stretch out for 10 incredibly uncomfortable seconds. I did not open my mouth to speak. I simply nodded slightly toward my attorney. Grace opened the binder. Grace did not bother to return the opposing lawyer's aggressive posturing. She completely ignored his threatening tone. She simply reached out with calm, incredibly precise movements, opened the heavy black binder, and smoothly flipped to the very first tab. She extracted a crisp, perfectly clean photocopy of the legal document and slid it effortlessly across the wide, polished oak table. It came to a stop directly in front of Reginald. "Before we entertain any completely fabricated offers of settlement regarding allegedly stolen assets," Grace said, her voice dropping into a low, incredibly sharp, and purely clinical register, "I strongly suggest you review the actual legal status of the estate in question." Reginald frowned deeply, clearly annoyed by the interruption of his rehearsed intimidation script. He dismissively picked up the paper, fully expecting it to be a pathetic, poorly drafted letter of defense or a meaningless personal plea. I watched his eyes scan the very first bolded paragraph. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly fascinating to witness. The arrogant, relaxed posture completely vanished. His spine stiffened. His expensive gold pen abruptly stopped tapping. He pushed his reading glasses slightly further up his nose and rapidly read the second paragraph, his face noticeably losing its healthy color. "What is that, Reginald?" Camila demanded sharply, her voice completely losing its previous breathy warmth. She clearly did not like the sudden, unexpected shift in the room's carefully controlled dynamic. Reginald did not look at her. He swallowed hard. "It is an irrevocable trust," he finally stated, his voice completely flat, completely drained of its former threatening bravado. He carefully set the paper back down on the table, treating it like a live explosive. "Signed, fully notarized, and legally executed by Maddox exactly 3 full years ago. It officially transfers the entirety of his financial assets and the complete, undisputed ownership of the archival collection into the trust." Gregory uncrossed his arms, leaning forward with a deeply confused, angry scowl. "And who exactly controls this trust?" he demanded loudly. "Elizabeth does," Reginald replied quietly, finally turning to look directly at his deeply arrogant clients. "She is the sole legally appointed trustee and the exclusive beneficiary. The assets were completely and legally transferred long before his passing. They are absolutely not part of his personal estate. Therefore, you have absolutely zero legal standing to sue for their return. They belong entirely to her." The perfect intellectual smile on Camila's face did not simply fade, it violently shattered. Her jaw dropped slightly, her eyes darting frantically between her highly paid lawyer and the completely calm, unmoving expression on my face. The absolute realization that she had completely lost the massive inheritance she had arrogantly claimed in the newspaper was finally hitting her. The crushing, undeniable fact that she possessed absolutely no legal power to terrorize me was sinking in. I leaned slightly forward, resting my hands quietly on the edge of the table. "You sent a lawyer to demand stolen property, Mother," I said calmly. "I brought the law." The silence following Grace's revelation was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a massive ship finally hitting the ocean floor. Reginald stared at the trust document, his professional mask slipping into genuine, unadulterated panic. Camila's breathing had become shallow and erratic. The invincible matriarch was suddenly frantically searching for an exit that simply did not exist. She opened her mouth to speak, likely to launch into another deeply rehearsed, manipulative tirade about my supposed ingratitude, but I did not give her the space to breathe. With incredibly slow, deliberate movements, I reached forward and flipped the heavy plastic divider to the second tab. I carefully extracted a thick stack of high-resolution color photocopies. I deliberately slid the stack across the smooth oak table. It stopped precisely between Camila and her deeply unsettled attorney. The very top page displayed a beautifully scanned image of faded blue-lined paper, completely covered in elegant cursive handwriting. I watched Camila's eyes drop to the page. I watched the exact precise second. Her brain registered the deeply familiar handwriting. It was a handwriting she had secretly studied, meticulously transcribed, and ruthlessly exploited over 20 years ago. It was Eleanor's private journal. You built an entire celebrated academic empire on the brilliant concept of intellectual integrity, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed loudly in the tense room. Your breakout memoir won prestigious awards. It secured your unshakable university tenure. It made you the undisputed, powerful matriarch of Boston's literary elite. But you did not actually write the most profound, celebrated chapters of that book, Mother. I slowly pulled out a second stack of paper. It was a printed copy of her famous memoir with dozens of long, specific paragraphs heavily highlighted in bright yellow ink. I placed it directly next to the scanned journal entries. Eleanor wrote them, I stated the absolute truth, landing like a physical blow on the table. Maddox kept her original journal safely locked away for decades. He knew exactly what you did. He watched you arrogantly build your massive, highly lucrative career on his late wife's stolen, most intimate thoughts. He knew you were an intellectual fraud. Gregory's face drained of all healthy color. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the identical side-by-side texts. As a lifelong tenured professor, he perfectly understood the sheer catastrophic magnitude of blatant plagiarism. It was the ultimate, unforgivable academic death sentence. Vanessa physically recoiled in her heavy leather chair, pressing her back against the upholstery as if she were desperately trying to meld into the wall and disappear. She stared at her mother with wide, completely horrified eyes. Camila did not attempt to defend herself. She did not yell, and she did not aggressively deny the incredibly clear physical evidence laid out before her. She simply stared down at the faded blue ink, her perfectly manicured hands tightly gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table. The flawless, intellectually superior woman who had spent 34 years constantly calling me entirely useless and completely untalented was now sitting in complete agonizing silence. Utterly paralyzed by her own massive, undeniable hypocrisy, I watched her carefully constructed, deeply arrogant world completely collapse. The mask was gone. Gregory was the very first person to finally break the suffocating heavy silence. He looked desperately at Reginald, his voice completely lacking its usual booming professorial authority. He stammered frantically, asking what this meant and how they could quickly contain the damaging information. Reginald did not immediately answer. The expensive, highly aggressive lawyer was far too busy frantically calculating his own professional liability in representing a deeply compromised fraudulent client. I did not wait for them to form a cohesive defensive strategy. I kept my hands folded neatly on top of the black binder, fully commanding the absolute center of the room. There is absolutely no containing this, Gregory, I said intentionally, using his first name, deliberately stripping away his unearned parental title. He flinched at the sound of it. You do not hold any negotiating power here. You are not graciously offering me a quiet, painless family settlement. I am offering you an incredibly generous, highly conditional ultimatum, and you have exactly 2 minutes to completely agree to my terms before I walk out that glass door. I looked directly at Camila. She was still staring blankly at the plagiarized text, looking entirely hollow and incredibly old. By 5 o'clock this evening, I stated clearly my voice, carrying the unwavering weight of a final verdict. Your attorneys will officially formally withdraw the ridiculous civil lawsuit regarding financial elder abuse. You will immediately cease all aggressive legal communications. Furthermore, you will personally contact every single university department, head gallery owner, and academic colleague you deliberately poisoned with your malicious fabricated whisper campaign. You will explicitly tell them you were completely mistaken and that my professional integrity is absolutely beyond any reproach. Vanessa finally found her extremely weak voice. She leaned forward, her eyes pleading desperately. She shakily whispered that I could not possibly force them to publicly humiliate themselves in front of their prestigious peers. She claimed it would completely ruin the family's distinguished reputation overnight. I looked at my older sister, feeling absolutely no lingering empathy for her pathetic, cowardly complicity. She had happily stood by and eagerly participated while they systematically attempted to destroy my sole livelihood and take away my daughter's secure future. If those exact conditions are not completely met by 5 o'clock, I continued smoothly, completely ignoring Vanessa's pathetic interruption. This entire highly detailed file will immediately be hand-delivered to the senior arts editor at the Boston Globe. They already have a long-standing, deep interest in your mother's prestigious career. I imagine a heavily documented, undeniable story about a celebrated academic matriarch ruthlessly stealing a dead woman's private thoughts to build her empire will make the Sunday front page. The subsequent university ethics investigation will easily handle the rest. I watched the sheer absolute terror fully materialize in Camila's dark eyes. The one thing she valued exponentially more than money or family was her pristine, deeply fabricated public image. The terrifying thought of being completely exposed, utterly disgraced, and permanently stripped of her elite academic standing was a fate far worse than death for a true narcissist. I held all the devastating cards, and she absolutely knew it. I calmly took a slow, refreshing sip of my sparkling water. The clock was ticking. Just as the absolute reality of my devastating ultimatum began to fully settle over the room, Reginald suddenly sat up straight. A highly experienced, incredibly ruthless lawyer rarely surrenders without attempting one final desperate maneuver to forcefully regain control of the shattered narrative. He violently cleared his throat aggressively, pushed the damning plagiarism evidence slightly to the side, and quickly pulled a heavily redacted, official-looking document from his thick leather portfolio. He slammed it down onto the oak table, desperately trying to project a renewed sense of powerful legal authority. "This is a formal, highly detailed medical assessment," Reginald announced loudly, his voice echoing sharply against the wood-paneled walls. It was officially documented by a consulting physician during one of Mr. Maddox's brief hospital visits late last summer. It clearly indicates that the patient was actively exhibiting severe, undeniable early signs of advanced dementia. Given this deeply concerning medical timeline, we can easily argue in open court that the irrevocable trust was signed by a highly vulnerable man who completely lacked the required mental capacity. You manipulated a confused elder Elizabeth. That completely invalidates the trust. For a brief, highly tense second, a glimmer of desperate, pathetic hope sparked in Camila's wide eyes. She desperately clung to this new fabricated lifeline, eagerly wanting to believe that her expensive lawyer had successfully found a magical loophole to violently flip the power dynamic back in her absolute favor. Gregory actually sat up taller, a smug, highly familiar sneer, briefly returning to his pale face. They deeply expected me to finally panic. They expected my calm, methodical facade to shatter under the terrifying threat of a prolonged, messy medical dispute. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I simply turned to Grace, who was already offering a small, incredibly cold, and deeply satisfied smile. I reached forward with absolute unhurried precision and flipped the heavy plastic divider to the third tab. I smoothly extracted a small, sleek silver USB drive and a sealed, officially stamped envelope. I placed them gently in the center of the table. That assessment was a preliminary, incredibly brief observation made by an on-call resident who interacted with Maddox for exactly 12 minutes. I said quietly, completely dismantling his aggressive bluff. This, I continued tapping the sealed envelope, is a comprehensive, highly extensive psychiatric evaluation conducted by the hospital's senior chief of neurology. It explicitly, undeniably certifies that Maddox was completely, perfectly lucid and entirely capable of making highly complex legal and financial decisions. And this, I pointed to the small silver drive, is an unbroken high-definition video recording of that exact psychological evaluation, filmed precisely 1 hour before he formally signed the trust documents. The signing itself was fully witnessed by the private bank's senior director. Reginald stared at the silver drive. He did not attempt to pick it up. He did not try to offer another aggressive counterargument. He simply looked at the incredibly detailed, legally flawless trap I had patiently laid out for him. He realized with absolute terrifying certainty that continuing to fight this case would cross the line from standard aggressive litigation into severe career-ending professional malpractice. He slowly closed his leather portfolio, the sharp snap of the metal clasp sounding like a loud gunshot in the silent room. He looked directly at my father. He quit the case. Reginald stood up slowly, meticulously straightening his expensive silk tie. He did not look at Camila, and he absolutely refused to make any further eye contact with me or Grace. He simply informed his completely stunned clients that his prestigious firm was officially withdrawing as their legal counsel effective immediately, and that they would promptly receive a final, heavily itemized invoice for his wasted time, without another single word. He confidently picked up his thick leather portfolio, turned his back on the completely ruined family, and briskly walked out of the heavy glass doors. The profound, empty silence he left behind was absolutely deafening. Camila remained entirely frozen in her heavy leather chair. The desperate, fleeting spark of hope that had briefly illuminated her dark eyes was completely, permanently extinguished. She looked incredibly small, deeply fragile, and profoundly aged. The massive, intimidating aura of intellectual superiority she had aggressively weaponized against me for over 3 decades had completely evaporated into the cold, recycled air of the conference room. Gregory was trembling visibly, his hands tightly gripping the solid wooden armrests, as if the entire polished floor was suddenly tilting beneath his expensive shoes. They had walked into the room fully expecting an easy, satisfying slaughter. They were leaving with absolutely nothing. I carefully, methodically closed the heavy black binder. The sharp, decisive click of the metal rings signaled the absolute end of the long, exhausting war. I did not offer them any parting words of unnecessary cruelty, nor did I attempt to extract a meaningless forced apology. I simply stood up, offered Grace a quiet, deeply appreciative nod, and calmly walked out of the room. I did not look back over my shoulder to witness their final, pathetic moments of realization. I rode the sleek elevator down to the busy Boston street, stepped out into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight, and took a long, incredibly deep breath of fresh, untainted air. The subsequent fallout was not spectacular or explosive. It was a slow, incredibly quiet, and profoundly devastating social death. By 4 o'clock that exact same afternoon, I received a short, legally binding email confirming that the frivolous civil lawsuit had been entirely permanently withdrawn. Over the next several weeks, the malicious, fabricated rumors in the academic community completely stopped, replaced by a sudden, incredibly awkward, and deeply noticeable silence whenever Camila's famous name was casually mentioned. Her highly anticipated next manuscript was suddenly and politely rejected by her long-standing publisher, citing vague, unconvincing changes in market trends. Gregory quietly announced his unexpectedly early retirement from the university faculty just 2 months later, citing deeply personal health reasons. They did not lose their sprawling, expensive home, and they were not publicly paraded through the streets in handcuffs. But in the incredibly insular, highly competitive world of Boston's literary elite, they simply ceased to matter. They were permanently locked inside a deeply hollow, rapidly decaying reputation of their own meticulous making, completely isolated from the genuine respect they so desperately craved. The empire had crumbled. Several peaceful, incredibly productive months eventually passed. The crisp, biting winter slowly melted into a beautiful, vibrant New England spring. I officially used a carefully calculated portion of the substantial funds Maddox had generously left behind to secure a stunning, sunlit commercial space in a quiet, historic neighborhood just outside the busy city center. The large arched front windows let in an abundance of natural, warm light, creating the perfect, serene environment for delicate archival work. I officially opened the Maddox Archive, an independent, highly specialized center dedicated exclusively to the meticulous restoration of rare historical texts and private collections. But it was much more than just a successful, highly lucrative business. I legally structured a significant permanent portion of the center's steady profits to heavily fund a specialized, comprehensive educational program specifically designed for local children struggling with severe dyslexia. We hired dedicated patient tutors and purchased an extensive library of specialized, accessible reading materials. The beautiful, quiet space that smelled wonderfully of old paper and fresh wood quickly became a genuine, incredibly safe haven for children who felt marginalized by traditional, highly rigid academic systems. It was the exact perfect tribute to the kind, patient man who had patiently taught my own daughter how to conquer her deepest, most terrifying fears. On a particularly warm, quiet Saturday morning in late May, I was standing comfortably by the large front window, carefully repairing the slightly torn binding of an 18th century journal. The workspace was perfectly organized, completely peaceful, and entirely mine. Lena was sitting comfortably on a soft, overstuffed chair in the corner of the room. The heavy, slanted cherry wood reading stand Maddox had built for her was resting securely on her small lap. She was completely engrossed in a thick, colorful chapter book, her eyes moving smoothly and confidently across the wide pages. She was not struggling, she was not hiding, she was simply enjoying the profound, beautiful magic of a well-told story. I watched her quietly for a long moment, a deep, overwhelming sense of absolute gratitude washing over my entire spirit. For my entire life, I had been aggressively taught that success was strictly measured by prestigious awards, public accolades, and the highly conditional approval of deeply arrogant people. But standing there in the warm sunlight, simply watching my brilliant daughter confidently read, without a single ounce of fear or anxiety, I finally understood what true, enduring success actually looked like. It looked like safety. It looked like absolute, unshakable peace. I had successfully broken the heavy toxic chains of generational emotional abuse. I had deeply protected my child, completely secured my independence, and beautifully honored the lasting memory of the one true mentor who had genuinely loved us. I did not have a massive, highly publicized literary empire, and I did not have a famous, critically acclaimed name printed in bold letters on the Sunday bestseller lists, but I had something infinitely more valuable and incredibly more permanent. I had built a completely honest, deeply meaningful life entirely on my own precise terms. The light was perfect. The only lingering thread from my past attempted to quietly weave its way back into my life in late August, roughly 9 months after the devastating meeting at the law firm. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had just returned home from the archive center, feeling comfortably exhausted after a long day of delicate restoration work. I checked the small brass mailbox in the lobby of my apartment building. Nestled between a few utility bills and a glossy catalog was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The incredibly precise, overly stylized cursive handwriting on the front was instantly deeply familiar. It was from Vanessa. I did not immediately tear it open in a frantic panic. I did not feel a sudden sickening drop in my stomach. I calmly carried the mail upstairs, set my keys on the counter, and walked into the kitchen to prepare a cup of hot tea. I specifically chose Earl Grey, the exact same blend Maddox used to gently brew for me during those long, quiet afternoons in his Concord study. I let the tea steep perfectly, the rich bergamot-scented steam slowly filling the quiet kitchen. I picked up the thick envelope and carried it to the large bay window, sitting down in the warm, late afternoon sunlight. I knew exactly what the letter contained without needing to read a single word. Vanessa was not writing to offer a profound, genuine apology for standing silently by while our mother attempted to publicly destroy my life. She was writing because, with me permanently gone, she was now the sole exclusive target of Camila's suffocating, deeply toxic demands. The letter would be filled with highly manipulative phrases about how Mother is suffering, how the family is broken, and how I needed to be the bigger person and initiate a quiet, dignified reconciliation. Vanessa desperately wanted me back in the established family dynamic, not because she genuinely missed my presence, but because she desperately needed her convenient human shield back. A younger, deeply traumatized version of myself would have opened the letter. I would have read every single manipulative word, painstakingly searching for a tiny, hidden crumb of genuine sisterly affection. I would have spent days agonizing over the perfect, measured response. But the woman sitting by the window, holding the warm mug of tea, was completely different. I understood now that engaging with them, even just to firmly decline their pathetic invitations, was simply handing them the emotional access they felt entitled to. True peace does not require having the absolute last word in an argument. True peace is realizing the exhausting argument is completely irrelevant. I did not rip the thick envelope into pieces. I did not angrily throw it into the fireplace. I simply stood up, walked into my bedroom, and opened the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden dresser. I calmly placed the unopened letter far in the back, directly underneath a stack of old, thick winter sweaters. I would leave it there, completely unread, a silent monument to a deeply toxic war. I had absolutely no intention of ever fighting again. Sometimes, the most profound act of forgiveness you can offer yourself is the quiet, absolute refusal to allow the people who broke you to ever touch your life again. The drawer clicked shut. When you spend your entire life being explicitly told that you are the defective, useless member of a prestigious family, you slowly begin to believe that love is something you must desperately earn through flawless obedience. You learn to quietly shrink yourself to avoid their harsh criticism. You learn to constantly doubt your own clear reality because they are so incredibly adept at rewriting it to suit their massive egos. But the most profound, beautiful truth I learned from walking away is that you absolutely do not have to inherit the heavy, suffocating silence of the people who raised you. You have the absolute right to write a completely different ending. If you are listening to this right now and you have spent years feeling like an outsider at your own family's dining table, I need you to hear this very clearly. You are not overly sensitive. You are not dramatically holding on to the past, and you are absolutely not the useless one. You are simply a person who finally recognized the toxic poison they were attempting to serve you, and you bravely refused to take another sip. The profound discomfort they feel around you is not a reflection of your supposed flaws. It is a direct reflection of their absolute terror that you can finally see through their meticulously constructed, deeply fragile masks. Maddox taught me a philosophy that completely changed the trajectory of my life. He proved to me through his endless patience and his quiet, fierce protection that biology is simply a random lottery. Blood makes you related. Loyalty, respect, and consistent kindness make you family. I did not find my true family in the sprawling, prestigious estates of Boston's literary elite. I found my family in the quiet, dusty corners of an old wooden house and in the bright, joyful eyes of a little girl who finally learned how to read without fear. The greatest legacy you can possibly leave behind is not a massive trust fund or a celebrated best-selling memoir built on stolen words. The greatest legacy is the absolute unshakable truth you fiercely protect and the deeply safe, entirely peaceful life you painstakingly build from the shattered pieces they left behind. I walked away from a highly prestigious, incredibly toxic empire, and I built a quiet, beautiful sanctuary where the truth actually matters. Camila's massive, fabricated legacy will eventually fade away into total obscurity, completely buried under the undeniable weight of her own quiet disgrace. But the truth Maddox protected, and the safe, warm home I built for Lena will beautifully outlast all of them. If you've ever walked away from a toxic table and built your own, I want to hear your story. Share this with someone who desperately needs the courage to walk away today. You are not useless. You are simply in the completely wrong house. I am finally home.